The throne room of Emperor Varaxia, ruler of the Galactic Empire, was an imposing structure of towering spires and impossible geometry. It was said that the palace itself was a living thing, grown from the finest materials in the galaxy, fused with the power of untold stars. The walls hummed with energy, reflecting the endless achievements of the Empire, and the floor gleamed like liquid silver. At the center of this awe-inspiring space, Emperor Varaxia sat upon his obsidian throne. The throne itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the heart of a machine that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. His form was tall and regal, his skin a smooth pale gray with faint glowing lines that traced his veins like the patterns of a distant nebula. His eyes, however, were what drew the attention. They were the color of the blackest void, ever shifting like the infinite depths of space itself. Around him, the Emperor's elite guard stood in formation, statuesque and silent, their tall frames covered in gleaming armor. Each of them was a pinnacle of warfare, genetically enhanced beings forged in the crucible of combat over millennia. They were the ultimate soldiers, feared throughout the galaxy. No army, no force, no being could stand against them. Yet today they were gathered here not out of fear or reverence, but out of curiosity. A human. The very thought of a mere human standing before the Emperor was laughable to many of the elite guards. To them, the human race was a primitive and insignificant species, one that had only recently begun to claw its way out of the Stone Age, barely worth the time to study, let alone acknowledge. But reports had come to the Emperor's attention, reports of a lone human who had somehow, against all odds, survived an encounter with the pirates who had crossed into Imperial space. Commander Brix, the leader of the Emperor's elite guards, had been the first to bring the human to Varaxia's attention. "A warrior unlike any we've encountered," Brix had said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "An Earthling. He claims to have fought off a squadron of pirate ships using nothing but his ship's guns and his fists. He's been captured now, brought here for evaluation." Varaxia had smiled, the corners of his lips curving ever so slightly. "A human warrior? How amusing." The doors to the throne room opened with a sharp hiss, and the figure that entered caused even the guards to stiffen in surprise. He was unremarkable by most standards. His dark hair, unkempt, framed a face that was both rugged and tired. His clothes were torn, stained with sweat and dirt, as though he had been dragged across 1,000 worlds. His eyes, however, were different, alive with a fiery intensity that set him apart from the rest of the prisoners the Empire had dealt with. Kael, that was his name. Commander Brix stepped forward, his expression a mixture of contempt and amusement. "So, this is the great human warrior. You certainly don't look like much." Kael's eyes locked with Brix's, unwavering. He stood tall despite his fatigue, his shoulders squared in defiance. "I've seen worse," he muttered, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. The Emperor's gaze fell upon him, his eyes narrowing as he studied this so-called warrior. "What do you hope to achieve by coming here, human? You stand before the might of the Galactic Empire. No one defies us. No one survives us." "Stiva?" Kael shrugged, as if the Emperor's words were nothing more than an afterthought. "I didn't come here to bow to you. I came to prove something you've all forgotten." "Prove?" The Emperor's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it echoed through the room like a clap of thunder. "You'll have to do more than speak your intentions, human. Actions speak louder than words. If you have any hope of surviving this, you'll need to show us." The Emperor signaled to his guards, "Let us see what this human can do." Without a word, Brix and several of the other elite warriors approached Kael, their movements swift and coordinated, a well-practiced dance of deadly grace. Kael remained still, his eyes never leaving the commander. He had been through worse, far worse. But something about the way these beings moved, the way they exuded an almost perfect harmony of strength, speed, and precision, made his pulse quicken. This was no ordinary combat. "Let's see if this human has any fight in him," Brix said with a sneer, drawing his blade, a long, jagged sword that hummed with an unnatural energy. One of the other guards, a towering figure whose armor was adorned with red and black stripes, stepped forward. "You should be honored, Earthling," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "We are the finest warriors in the galaxy, the greatest combatants to ever exist, and you are nothing." Kael didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of words, especially not from someone who had never bled for survival. The guard swung his sword at Kael with a speed that would have cleaved most men in half, but Kael, quick as lightning, ducked under the blow and countered with a low kick, knocking the guard off balance. The blow was swift, calculated, and precise, far more so than the guard had expected. For a moment there was silence. The guards, even Brix, were momentarily stunned. How could this human, with his bare hands and nothing more than the strength of his will, have evaded a strike from one of their own? Brix, his features contorted with anger, immediately lunged forward, his blade aimed directly at Kael's throat. But Kael's movements were fluid, effortless. He sidestepped the attack, grabbed Brix's wrist, and twisted it with the precision of someone who had fought for his life more times than he could count. Brix grunted in pain as the blade fell from his hand. "You're faster than you look," Brix said, seething with frustration. Kael didn't answer. Instead, he swept Brix's legs out from under him with a quick spinning kick, sending the commander crashing to the ground. The sound of metal clattering echoed through the chamber, and the entire room fell into a stunned silence. The elite guards watched in disbelief. This human, this insignificant creature who they had thought would be an easy target, had taken down their commander with such ease. It was impossible. No one could defeat a member of the elite guard. The Emperor's expression remained unchanged, though his mind was racing. He had expected an amusing spectacle, a display of the Empire's dominance over a lowly human. Instead, he was witnessing something unexpected, something that made even him pause. Kael stood over Brix, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He was battered and bruised, but there was something in the way he carried himself, an undeniable aura of strength, determination, and defiance. The Emperor raised a hand, signaling for the guards to step back. "Enough." For a moment, no one moved. The Emperor's voice was low, yet filled with an unspoken command. "You are different," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What is it about you, human, that makes you so resilient?" Kael wiped the sweat from his brow and stood tall. "I've fought for everything I have. I didn't get this far by sitting back and waiting for others to do the work." "You speak of fighting," the Emperor mused. "But tell me, what does a human know of true combat? You are nothing more than an insect, a speck of dust in the grand order of the galaxy." Kael's lips curled into a wry smile. "Maybe, but insects can be dangerous. Sometimes they're the ones that make the biggest impact." For the first time since the human had arrived, the Emperor's lips curled into a faint smile. It was not one of amusement, but one of something darker, a recognition of something he had never expected. "Very well," the Emperor said, his voice low and commanding. You have proven your worth, human. But remember this: surviving us is not enough. If you want to be more than a mere insect, if you want to earn your place among us, you will need to do much more than show strength. You will need to show us that you understand the true nature of power. Kael raised an eyebrow. And what do you suggest? The Emperor's eyes glittered with something unreadable. I suggest you prove yourself. Further, show me that you have the fortitude to face what is to come. Kael stared at the Emperor, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his gaze before he nodded. Then, let's begin. Kael had never imagined he would stand in the heart of the Galactic Empire, face to face with the Emperor himself. After all, he was just a human, a soldier who had seen more battle than anyone would care to count, but still nothing more than a speck in the vast universe. And yet here he was, in the heart of an empire that spanned countless star systems, surrounded by the most lethal and genetically enhanced warriors the galaxy had ever known. He had fought off pirates, survived impossible odds, and endured endless hardship. But this was different. This was the Galactic Empire. The throne room loomed around him, filled with endless corridors of darkness and gleaming walls that seemed to pulse with some unknown energy. The Emperor sat before him on an obsidian throne, regal and unyielding, his eyes black like the void of space, his form radiating an eerie presence. He was the ruler of everything, the supreme leader of the known universe. And yet, as Kael stood before him, it was clear that this emperor had never truly encountered a human quite like him. The elite guards, towering warriors clad in shimmering armor that seemed to shimmer and hume with energy, stood at attention. They were known across the galaxy for their brutality, strength, and unshakable loyalty. Each guard was a genetic masterpiece engineered for war. Kael couldn't help but admire their imposing forms, even as he despised the idea of them flesh and metal fused into something monstrous. How much more would... Kael had faced death more times than he cared to remember. He had been forced to fight for his life, to survive when it seemed impossible. His time on Earth had shaped him, forged him in the fires of desperation and violence. But this was new. This wasn't just survival. This was about something deeper, something more. The Emperor studied him with keen interest, and Kael could feel the weight of his gaze, like an invisible hand pressing down on him. The Emperor's voice, when it came, was calm, yet filled with authority. "You are a curious thing, human. What brings you here, to my domain?" Kael could feel the eyes of the elite guards burning into him. They didn't believe a human could threaten them. They thought him weak, a child playing at war. But he wasn't here to beg for mercy. He wasn't here to kneel. "I didn't come here to bow," Kael replied, his voice steady and clear. "I came to show you something. Something that even your so-called perfect warriors might not understand." The Emperor raised an eyebrow, his fingers lightly tracing the armrest of his throne. "And what might that be?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Strength isn't just in the body," Kael said, his eyes never leaving the Emperor's. "It's in the mind, in the will to survive when every part of you tells you to give up. You may have your genetically enhanced warriors, your superior technology, but you've forgotten what it means to fight for something you can't afford to lose. That's what makes us dangerous." The guards, sensing an insult in Kael's words, stiffened. But the Emperor merely studied him, his expression inscrutable. "You believe that your mind, your will can overcome the might of my empire?" the Emperor asked, his voice a mere whisper in the cavernous room. "I admire your courage, But let us see if your mind and will can withstand the strength of my warriors." Kael nodded, but the look in his eyes hardened. "I've never backed down before, and I don't intend to start now." With a sudden motion, the Emperor raised his hand, signaling for his elite guards to step forward. The air in the room seemed to crackle with anticipation. "I'm curious to see if you truly understand what you're saying," the Emperor continued, his voice filled with an almost imperceptible edge. "Let's see if your will can overcome the true power of the Empire." Kael tensed, his muscles coiling as the first of the guards, Brix, the commander, stepped forward. Brix was tall, his armor a combination of dark silver and black, with red markings that denoted his status as a leader among the guards. His eyes gleamed with a predatory gleam, his every movement radiating confidence. "Let me show you what happens to those who challenge the Empire," Brix said, his voice cold and mocking. With a swift motion, Brix drew his weapon, a massive energy sword that crackled with destructive power. The blade hummed as he raised it above his head, preparing to strike down on the human before him. Kael's eyes never left Brix's, but he could feel the pulse of his own heartbeat quicken. This wasn't a mere sparring match. This was life or death. He had to win. There was no other option. "Come on then," Kael said, his voice low and steady. "Let's see if you can actually land a hit." Brix sneered, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "You really think you can survive against me?" he taunted, swinging the sword down with incredible force. Kael barely had time to react. He ducked under the blade, narrowly avoiding the lethal strike. The force of the swing sent a gust of air that made his hair whip around his face, but he remained focused. His feet slid across the floor as he sidestepped, moving with a fluidity that surprised even him. Brix growled in frustration, spinning around to deliver another blow, but Kael wasn't there. Instead, he was behind him, launching a swift kick that struck Brix's side with a sickening thud. Brix staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. "You're faster than you look," Brix admitted, his voice laced with irritation. But there was something else in his tone, a hint of recognition. Kael wasn't some simpleton who had wandered into the palace by accident. He was a warrior. And warriors didn't back down. Kael didn't wait for Brix to recover. He closed the distance, his fists flying in a rapid sequence of strikes that landed with precision. His punches were calculated, each one targeting weak points in Brix's armor. The guard flinched with every hit, his movements slowing as Kael's relentless assault continued. The elite guards around the room watched in disbelief. This human, this insignificant creature from a backwater world, was holding his own against one of their best. For a moment it seemed as though Kael might actually win, but Brix, though stunned, wasn't finished. With a roar of frustration, he unleashed a brutal counterattack, bringing the energy sword down in a vicious arc. Kael barely managed to dodge in time, but the blade grazed his side, slicing through his armor and drawing a line of blood. Kael gritted his teeth, feeling the searing pain, but it only fueled him further. He wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. "You're good," Brix said, his voice almost begrudgingly respectful. "But you won't survive this." With a sudden burst of energy, Brix swung his blade in a sweeping motion, aiming to disarm Kael. The strike was fast, powerful, and nearly impossible to avoid. But Kael, through sheer instinct, dropped to the ground, sliding underneath the attack just as the blade crashed into the floor, sending sparks flying. He grabbed Brix's leg and pulled with all his might, using the commander's own momentum to send him crashing to the ground with a bone-shaking thud. Brix, gasping for breath, struggled to get up, but Kael was already standing over him, his breathing ragged, his eyes filled with determination. "You're down," Kael said quietly, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. "Who's next?" The other elite guards were now visibly unsettled. Kael had taken down Brix, one of their most feared and respected warriors. He had proven something something they hadn't expected. You're better than we thought, Tzarn, a towering guard with skin like molten rock, said slowly. He stepped forward, a look of curiosity in his eyes. Maybe, Kael said, wiping the sweat from his brow. But I'm not finished yet. The Emperor watched the spectacle unfold, his dark eyes never leaving Kael. He had anticipated a show, a spectacle of domination. Instead, he was watching a human defy the very expectations of the Empire. You've done well, human, the Emperor said, his voice low and dangerous. But we are far from finished. I hope you understand that this is merely the beginning. Kael stood tall, blood trickling down his side, but his eyes never wavered. Bring it on. The throne room had fallen into an eerie silence. The air was thick with tension, each breath in the chamber hanging heavy like an impending storm. Kael stood over Brix, the commander of the Emperor's elite guards, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Blood trickled down his side from a cut where Brix's energy sword had grazed him, but the pain was almost an afterthought. His mind was consumed with the battle, his focus unshakable. Around him, the Empire's most formidable warriors were now visibly unsettled. These were beings who had fought in wars spanning millennia, each one genetically enhanced, honed through the kind of brutal combat that would break most. They had witnessed entire civilizations crumble before them, and yet here was a human, a lone human, fighting with the relentless tenacity of someone who had no intention of losing. Kael hadn't come here to win their favor, nor had he come seeking their approval. He hadn't come to prove anything to them, but to prove something to himself. He was no longer the soldier who had fought on the fringes of the galaxy, the outcast in an endless war. He was here because the Empire represented everything he had ever fought against. And in this place, under the shadow of the Emperor's throne, Kael was going to make them see that humans were more than what they thought. Muldang, Kael said, his voice strained but resolute. Who's next? Tzarn, the towering guard with molten rock-like skin, was the first to step forward. His armor was etched with the marks of 100 battles, and his broad shoulders seemed to stretch as he moved with a slow, calculated grace. He sized up Kael with a look of disdain, his lips curling into a sneer. Impressive, Tzarn growled, but you've only faced one of us, and Brix was holding back. Kael's brow furrowed, his breath coming in quick bursts. He could feel his body beginning to tire, the wounds on his side throbbed with each movement, but he refused to let that stop him. He had to stay sharp, keep pushing forward. If he let up for even a moment, if he showed any sign of weakness, it would all be over. Bring it, Kael said, rolling his shoulders, preparing himself for the next round. Tzarn's eyes narrowed, and in a flash he was upon Kael. The speed and strength behind the attack was staggering. Tzarn's massive fist collided with the air, a crushing blow that would have shattered bones in an instant. But Kael was ready. He sidestepped the strike, his body moving with the grace of a man who had long honed his instincts in the heat of battle. He ducked under the next swing, sliding beneath Tzarn's reach like a shadow, his body low to the ground. Tzarn roared in frustration, but Kael was already up again, landing a punch to his side. The blow was hard enough to stagger the large guard, but it wasn't enough to bring him down. Tzarn retaliated, swinging with a series of brutal, fast strikes, each one designed to crush Kael into the ground. Yet for all his size and power, Tzarn couldn't land a hit. Kael's movements were fluid, each one a calculated dodge, a quick retreat, or a sudden precise counter. Kael's mind was racing, calculating, anticipating. He had fought in situations like this before. Outnumbered, outclassed, but never outwitted. He had spent years as a soldier, honing his ability to read his opponents, to adapt, to survive. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting to prove something much larger, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, could achieve the impossible. Tzarn's rage only seemed to grow with each failed strike. The more Kael dodged, the more he retaliated. It was a dance, a fight to the death, and Kael was determined to be the last one standing. "You're frustrating," Tzarn hissed, his voice laced with fury. "You should be dead by now." Kael didn't answer. Instead, he launched himself forward, using Tzarn's own momentum to knock him off balance. The massive guard stumbled backward, and Kael seized the opportunity. With a vicious strike, Kael's knee connected with Tzarn's abdomen, knocking the wind out of him. The guard crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Kael didn't wait for him to recover. He knew the next attack would come quickly, and if he was caught off guard, it could end him. He turned his attention back to the rest of the room, his eyes scanning the remaining elite guards. The Emperor's voice rang out, smooth and cold. "Enough!" The command was like a whip, cutting through the tension in the room. All movement stopped immediately. Even Tzarn, who was recovering on the floor, stilled at the sound of the Emperor's voice. Kael stood, his breathing heavy, his chest heaving with the exertion of the battle. Blood dripped from his side, but he refused to let it show. He was still standing, still alive. The Emperor's dark eyes locked onto Kael, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "You are more than what I expected. For a human, you have some fight in you." Kael wiped his brow, his eyes never leaving the Emperor. "I'm not done yet." The Emperor leaned forward, his long fingers drumming slowly on the armrest of his throne. "No, you're not, but I think you've proven your point. You've shown us that you can survive. But survival is not the same as victory, and victory, human, is what the Empire understands." Kael was silent for a moment, his mind working. "Survival is enough," he said finally. "It's all I've ever needed. And it's more than your empire can handle." A low chuckle echoed through the room, coming from a figure cloaked in shadow near the back. The voice that followed was like ice. "You think you can survive against us? Against me?" It was then that Kael noticed the figure, the one he hadn't seen before. It was a woman, tall and thin, with long flowing black hair that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her eyes were a piercing, unnatural silver, gleaming with an intensity that almost seemed to cut through Kael. Her features were sharp, almost inhumanly so, and the air around her pulsed with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Kael's neck stand up. The Emperor turned his gaze toward her. "Ah, my personal envoy, you've arrived just in time." The woman's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only calculation. "I've been watching this human for some time, my Emperor. His spirit, his tenacity, it intrigues me. But I'm afraid, much like all the others before him, he will fall." Kael stared at her, his muscles tightening. He had been in the presence of many deadly enemies before, but this woman, there was something different about her, something more than just power. "Who are you?" Kael asked, his voice tight, his stance defensive. The woman's smile deepened. "I am Varaxia, the Emperor's personal agent, his most trusted assassin, and I am the one who will end you." Kael's heart skipped a beat. He had faced enemies before, but an assassin, someone like her, was a different breed entirely. It wasn't just physical strength he had to overcome now. It was the unseen, the unexpected, the quick and lethal strike that could come from any direction. The Emperor's voice once again echoed through the chamber. "Varaxia will test you, human. If you are worthy of being more than a mere pawn in my game, you must defeat her. But know this, I will not intervene. Survive, and I will give you a place within the Empire. Fail, and you will die, just like the others before you." Kael swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. The stakes had just been raised. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that a human could stand toe-to-toe with the very forces that ruled the galaxy. Varaxia stepped forward, her movements like liquid, graceful, predatory. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone was enough to send a chill down Kael's spine. "You're mine," she said simply, as if it were a statement of fact. Kael braced himself. The battle was about to take a turn he had never expected. but he had come too far to back down now.